On a stormy night in Seoul, a powerful Korean mafia boss saved a stranded black woman, then disappeared before sunrise. 7 years later, her twin sons asked him a question that froze the entire hospital. "Why are you staring at our mom?" Amara Cole never planned to fall in love in a foreign country. She was just a young black woman studying abroad in Seoul, trying to build a future. But one violent storm changed everything. Stranded on an empty street with a twisted ankle and nowhere to go, a mysterious man stopped his car and stepped out of the rain. Tall, cold, powerful. His name was Jun-hyuk. That night, he stayed with her, treated her injured ankle, and protected her from the storm. Something about him felt dangerous, yet strangely safe. But when Amara woke up the next morning, he was gone.
No goodbye. No explanation. No trace.
2 days later, the news revealed the truth that would change Amara's life forever. The man who saved her that night was Kang Jun-hyuk, the ruthless heir of the most feared mafia syndicate in Seoul. And when Amara discovered she was pregnant, she knew only one thing: she had to disappear. But 7 years later, fate brought them face to face again. And this time, two little twins exposed a secret that could start a war inside the Korean mafia. I am so grateful to have you all here for Amara's journey. Before we continue, let's do a quick roll call. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country below. It's amazing to see this story reaching so many of you. We aren't just viewers and a creator. We are a family. Please subscribe and share. It really helps keep this chronicle alive. Now, let's get into the night it all began. The sky over Seoul didn't just rain. It screamed. It was the kind of storm that turned the neon-lit metropolis into a blurry, watercolor nightmare of gray and jagged electricity. Amara Cole pulled her thin jacket tighter against her chest, the fabric already heavy and useless against the deluge. Every step she took in her soaked sneakers felt like walking through a swamp, and her lungs burned with the damp, chilly air of an October night that had turned unexpectedly hostile. She was 21, thousands of miles from the warmth of her home, and currently, she was very much alone. She had been taking a shortcut through a hilly residential district, trying to get back to her dormitory after a late-night study session in a quiet corner of the city, but the storm had washed away her sense of direction. Then the world tilted. Her foot caught on the edge of a slick, uneven cobblestone, and her ankle gave way with a sickening, wet pop. The pain was instantaneous and white-hot, radiating up her leg like a lightning strike. Amara collapsed into a shallow puddle, a cry of genuine terror escaping her lips, lost instantly to the roar of the wind. She dragged herself toward the meager shelter of a closed storefront's awning, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The street was deserted. The luxury homes tucked behind high stone walls looked like fortresses, indifferent to the girl shivering on the pavement. She reached for her phone, but as she pulled it from her pocket, the screen remained dark. The charging port had succumbed to the rain. Panic, cold and paralyzing, began to settle in her chest. Then, through the curtain of falling water, two pinpricks of light appeared. A black sedan, sleek and obsidian as a shark, glided slowly up the hill. It moved with a predatory grace, its engine barely a whisper beneath the thunder. Amara waved her hand weakly, her pride long gone, replaced by a primal need for safety. The car didn't speed past. It slowed, the tires crunching softly on the grit, and came to a halt just feet away from her. The door opened, and for a second, Amara feared she might be trading one danger for another. A man stepped out, shielding himself with a large black umbrella that seemed to materialize from thin air. He was dressed in a suit that looked more expensive than her entire college tuition, yet he didn't seem to care that the hem of his trousers was getting ruined in the gutter. He moved toward her with a calm, measured pace that commanded the space around him. "You're hurt," he said. His voice was deep, a low baritone that cut through the cacophony of the storm. He spoke English with a slight, cultured accent, refined and steady. Amara looked up, squinting against the rain. Even in the dim light, his features were striking. He had a jawline that could have been carved from marble and eyes that seemed to hold a weary, ancient weight. "My ankle," she managed to say, her teeth chattering. "I fell. I can't walk." Without a word, the man knelt in the wet street. He didn't ask permission. He simply reached out and gently took her foot in his hand. His touch was warm, a startling contrast to the freezing rain. He felt the swelling around her joint with the practiced ease of someone used to dealing with crises. It is a severe sprain, perhaps a fracture. You cannot stay here. You will go into shock. He looked at her then, really looked at her. His gaze was intense, scanning her face with a level of scrutiny that made Amara's heart race for a reason that had nothing to do with fear. There was a magnetic pull to him, a gravity that felt impossible to resist. "I am Junhyuk," he said, providing nothing but a name. He didn't offer a title, a last name, or an explanation for why a man like him was wandering the backstreets of Seoul in a typhoon. "My home is just up this hill. It is the closest place to get you dry and tended to. Do you trust me, Amara?" She hadn't told him her name. She realized then she was wearing her university lanyard, her ID card dangling damply against her sweater. She looked into his dark, fathomless eyes and felt a strange, inexplicable sense of peace. In a city of millions of strangers, this one felt like a life raft. "Yes," she whispered. Junhyuk moved with effortless strength. He tucked the umbrella into the crook of his arm and lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He settled her into the leather-scented warmth of the sedan's back seat before rounding the car and sliding into the driver's seat. The heater was already humming, blasting life-giving air into the cabin. They drove for less than 3 minutes before passing through a massive iron gate that hissed open automatically. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture. All glass, dark stone, and hidden lights, perched on the edge of the hill like a crown. Inside, the silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Junhyuk carried her into a vast living area where a fireplace already crackled with a preset flame. He set her down on a deep, velvet sofa and disappeared for a moment, returning with a stack of thick, white towels and a first aid kit. He moved with a silent, feline grace, his movements economical and precise. "Wrap yourself in these," he commanded gently, handing her the towels. "I will prepare a brace for your ankle." As Amara dried her hair and tried to stop shaking, she watched him. He had removed his jacket, revealing a crisp white shirt that clung to the broad silhouette of his shoulders. He didn't look like a businessman. There was a hardness to him, a lingering shadow in the way he stood, always half-facing the door, always alert. He returned to her side and knelt again. He worked in silence, cleaning the scrapes on her leg and wrapping her ankle with a professional-grade compression bandage. Amara winced as he adjusted the joint, and instinctively, she reached out, her hand landing on his shoulder to steady herself. She felt the ripple of muscle beneath the cotton of his shirt, the heat of his skin. He froze for a fraction of a second at her touch, his eyes flicking up to hers. The air in the room shifted. The crackle of the fire seemed louder, the smell of wood smoke and his expensive, woody cologne swirling together. Amara felt a flush that had nothing to do with the heater. She was a black girl from a world of crowded subways and loud classrooms, and he was something else entirely. A ghost, a prince, a mystery. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Junhyuk didn't pull away. He finished the bandage but kept his hand resting lightly on her calf. "Because the storm brought you to me," he said. It wasn't a logical answer, but in the middle of that dark, violent night, it felt like the only truth that mattered. "And because I find I do not want to let you go back out into the cold." He stood and offered her a glass of dark, amber liquid brandy. "Drink. It will help the pain." As the night wore on, the storm outside seemed to fade into the background, creating a private universe for the two of them. They talked, though Junhyuk said little about himself. He listened as Amara spoke of her dreams of being a healer, of the loneliness of being an outsider in a foreign land, and of the vibrant life she had left behind to chase her ambitions. He watched her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. Every time she laughed, a small, rare softness touched the corners of his mouth. There was a deep, magnetic connection forming between them, a bridge built in the span of a few hours. It was as if they were two jagged pieces of a puzzle that finally found their fit. The power dynamic of the room was undeniable. He was the protector, the man with the fortress, but Amara didn't feel small. She felt cherished. Eventually, the exhaustion of the injury and the warmth of the fire took their toll. Jun Hyuk brought a silk blanket and tucked it around her, his fingers lingering near her cheek. "Sleep, Amara," he murmured. "You are safe here. Will you be here when I wake up?" she asked, her eyelids heavy. He didn't answer immediately. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The kiss was inevitable. It started as a ghost of a touch, a tentative exploration, before deepening into something desperate and soul-shattering. It tasted of brandy and hidden secrets, of a passion that felt like it had been waiting years to ignite. In that kiss, Amara felt the weight of his loneliness and the sudden, fierce spark of a man who had finally found something worth holding on to. She drifted off to sleep with the sound of his steady breathing nearby, her hand tucked into his. For the first time in her life, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. But the dawn is a cruel thing for those who live in the shadows. When the first pale light of morning filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the storm had passed, leaving the world sparkling and deceptively peaceful. Amara stirred, her hand reaching out for the warmth of the man who had held her through the night. Her fingers met only cold velvet. She sat up with a bolt of pain in her ankle, looking around the cavernous room. The fireplace was nothing but gray ash. The first aid kit was gone. The glass of brandy had been cleaned away. "Jun Hyuk?" she called out, her voice echoing off the glass walls. There was no answer. She limped through the house, her heart sinking with every empty room she discovered. The house felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a museum. It was pristine, cold, and utterly devoid of life. She made it to the heavy front door. It was unlocked. Outside, her sneakers had been cleaned and dried, sitting neatly on the mat. Beside them lay her phone, fully charged, along with a small, heavy object. She picked it up. It was a gold cufflink, intricately carved with the image of a dragon entwined around a sword. There was no note, no phone number,
No explanación.
Jun Hyuk was gone. He had vanished as if he were a figment of the storm's imagination, leaving her with a healed wound, a charged phone, and a hollow ache in her chest that told her life would never, ever be the same again. She stood on the driveway, looking back at the house that held the ghost of the most intense night of her life. She didn't know then that the man who saved her was a king of a dark empire. She didn't know that the blood-stained news of the coming days would shatter her perception of him. And she certainly didn't know that in a few weeks, she would realize that while Jun Hyuk had disappeared, he had left behind a part of himself that she would spend the next 7 years trying to hide from the world. Amara took a deep breath, pocketed the gold dragon, and began the long walk back to a reality that no longer felt like home. The golden dragon cufflink felt heavy in Amara's palm, a cold, metallic anchor in a world that had suddenly become untethered. For 48 hours, she had moved through the streets of Seoul like a somnambulist, her mind trapped in the sensory loop of that rainy night. She could still feel the phantom pressure of Jun Hyuk's hands on her skin, the way his low voice had seemed to vibrate in her very marrow, and the taste of the brandy that had warmed her blood. She had returned to her cramped dormitory, her injured ankle expertly bound, waiting for a sign. A call, a message, a knock on the door, that would prove the man wasn't a ghost. But silence was the only answer she received. The city hummed with its usual mechanical indifference, the neon signs of Hongdae flickering back to life as the storm clouds cleared. Amara tried to focus on her textbooks, but the equations and medical terms blurred into the memory of a dark suit and a jawline carved from granite. She told herself she was being foolish, a girl caught up in a momentary fairy tale born of trauma and exhaustion. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Amara was standing in a crowded convenience store, reaching for a bottle of water, when the atmosphere in the shop shifted. The upbeat K-pop track playing over the speakers was abruptly cut off, replaced by the somber, urgent tones of a news anchor. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head in the store turned toward the wall-mounted television, where the screen was flooded with images of black sedans and a massive police cordon. The headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screen in bold, jagged Hangul sent a ripple of audible gasps through the patrons. Amara's Korean was proficient enough to catch the words that mattered. Kong Syndicate, assassination, funeral. The footage cut to the entrance of a massive, traditional estate, the very one she had seen through the haze of rain, though now it looked less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress under siege. A massive crowd of men in identical black suits stood in rigid, military-like formations. They weren't just mourners. They were soldiers. "The Godfather is dead," someone whispered beside her, their voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. "Kang Dae-sung is gone. Seoul is going to burn." Amara's heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched as a mahogany casket, draped in white lilies and guarded by men with visible earpieces and bulging holsters, was carried toward a waiting hearse. Then, the camera zoomed in on the man leading the procession. The water bottle slipped from Amara's hand, hitting the linoleum with a dull thud. There he was. He wasn't the man who had knelt in the rain to tend to her wounds. He wasn't the man whose eyes had softened by the firelight. This man was a statue of ice and obsidian, dressed in a perfectly tailored black funeral suit, his hair swept back with lethal precision. Kang Junhyuk looked like a god of war. His face was a mask of terrifying neutrality, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses that reflected the flashing bulbs of 100 paparazzi cameras. The news anchor's voice grew more frantic, detailing the succession of the Kang syndicate. They spoke of Junhyuk not as a savior, but as a predator, the heir to the most powerful and ruthless criminal organization in the country. They played clips of the bloody shootout that had claimed his father's life, showing grainy CCTV footage of muzzle flashes and shattered glass. Amara felt the air leave her lungs. She looked down at the gold cufflink in her hand, the dragon and the sword. It wasn't a romantic keepsake. It was a crest. It was a symbol of a bloodline built on violence, shadow, and the broken lives of anyone who stood in their way. She realized with a sickening jolt that she hadn't been rescued by a mysterious businessman. She had been a temporary diversion for a man who lived in the heart of a monster. To him, she was a footnote. A girl he had picked up off the street in a moment of uncharacteristic whim. A stray he had fed and sheltered before returning to the business of death. The kiss that had felt like the beginning of her life was, to him, likely just a way to pass the time before he went out to bury a king and take his throne. The realization was a physical blow. She felt dirty, exposed, and utterly insignificant. She was a black girl from a middle-class family in America, a student who believed in healing and light, and she had spent the night in the arms of a man who dealt in darkness. The connection she had felt was a lie, a trick of the storm and her own loneliness. For the next week, Amara lived in a state of high-alert paranoia. Every time a black car slowed down on the street, her heart nearly stopped. Every time she saw a man in a suit, she looked the other way. She stopped going to her late-night shifts at the university library. She became a ghost in her own life, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the monsters she saw on the news to realize she had been in their inner sanctum. But as the days bled into 2 weeks, a different kind of fear took hold. It started with a subtle, persistent nausea that she tried to blame on the stress. Then came the exhaustion, a heavy, leaden weight in her limbs that no amount of sleep could fix. She was a nursing student. She knew the signs. She knew the math. She stood in the tiny, sterile bathroom of her dormitory, staring at the plastic stick in her hand. The 2 pink lines were so bright, so definitive, that they seemed to burn through the air. She was pregnant. Amara sat on the floor, the cold tile stinging her skin, and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She was carrying the child of the most dangerous man in Korea. She was carrying a secret heir to a syndicate that saw people as chess pieces. She thought of Junhyuk's cold face on the news. She thought of his father, dead in a shootout. She thought of the gold dragon. If she stayed, if she told him, her child would never know peace. They would be raised in a world of bulletproof glass and bodyguards. They would be targets from the moment they drew their first breath. Or worse, Junhyuk would see her as a liability, a loose end to be tied off so he could marry some highborn daughter of another syndicate to solidify his power. She wasn't a queen. She was a nurse. She was a mother. "I won't let them have you," she whispered, her hand pressing against her still flat stomach. "I won't let you be a monster." The decision was made in an instant, fueled by a primal, protective instinct that overrode her fear and her heartbreak. She couldn't just leave her dormitory. She had to disappear. She spent the next 48 hours in a blur of calculated desperation. She withdrew every cent from her savings account, taking it out in small increments from different ATMs across the city. She went to the university registrar and filed for an emergency medical leave of absence, citing a family crisis back home. She didn't pack her suitcases, that would look too much like a planned departure. She took only a backpack, her passport, and the most essential of her belongings. She left the gold dragon cufflink on the desk in her room, a final rejection of the world she had accidentally touched. But at the last second, she couldn't do it. She reached back and grabbed the cold metal, tucking it into the deepest pocket of her bag, not as a memory of him, but as a reminder of the danger she was running from. She didn't book a flight from Incheon. That was too obvious, too easily tracked by a man with Junhyuk's resources. Instead, she took a bus to a smaller coastal city, and then another to a rural terminal. She used cash for everything. She wore a heavy mask and a bucket hat, blending into the sea of commuters. Finally, 3 days after the positive test, she stood at the gate of a flight departing for a small city in Europe where she had a distant cousin she hadn't spoken to in years. From there, she would bounce to another country, and then another, until the trail was so cold that not even a Mafia king could find it. As the plane lifted off the tarmac, soaring over the glittering lights of Seoul, Amara didn't look back. She didn't think about the man who had saved her in the rain. She didn't think about the kiss that had changed her soul. She only thought about the heartbeat inside her, the secret she would protect with her life. Amara Cole, the girl who had been a footnote in a world of monsters, had just committed the ultimate act of defiance. She had stolen the future of the Kong Syndicate, and she was taking it into the shadows where it would never be found. 7 years had passed since the night the sky fell on Seoul, and for Amara, those years were a blur of midnight shifts, hushed lullabies, and the constant, low-thrumming vigilance of a woman who knew she was carrying stolen treasure. She had rebuilt herself in the shadows of Europe and North America, working twice as hard as anyone else to earn her credentials while raising 2 children who were the living, breathing evidence of a past she had tried to bury. But fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of irony. A lucrative contract at the Seoul International Medical Center, a facility catering to diplomats and the ultra-elite, had brought her back to the one place she swore she would never return. She was no longer the wide-eyed student who had been stranded in the rain. At 28, Amara moved with a quiet, clinical confidence, her movements precise and her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She went by her maiden name now, Amara Vance, and she wore her hair in a sharp, practical bob that signaled she was there to work, not to be noticed. She was one of the hospital's top surgical nurses, a woman whose steady hands and calm demeanor in the face of crisis had made her indispensable. But every time she walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital, she felt like she was stepping into a minefield. Her life was divided into 2 distinct worlds. At the hospital, she was the ghost in the scrubs, efficient and invisible. But at home, in their modest apartment tucked away in a quiet, nondescript neighborhood far from the glitz of Gangnam, she was everything. Noah, put your shoes on. Nia, your backpack is by the door, Amara called out, her voice softening as it always did when she spoke to them. The twins were 6 years old now, a perfect, chaotic blend of her heritage and the shadow of a man they would never know. Nia was a ray of sunshine, her curls bouncing as she danced around the kitchen, her laughter a melodic sound that could pierce through Amara's darkest moods. She had Amara's heart and a quick, inquisitive wit that often left her teachers stunned. But it was Noah who kept Amara's pulse in a state of permanent agitation. Noah didn't just look like his father, he inherited his soul. He had the same piercing, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to look right through people, a gaze that was far too heavy for a child. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a stubborn streak that was as immovable as a mountain. While other children played with toy cars, Noah liked to sit and watch the world, analyzing patterns, his small brow furrowing in concentration just like the man Amara saw on the news 7 years ago. He was a constant, walking reminder of the night of the storm, a living mirror of a man who had likely forgotten she ever existed. Mom, why do we have to go to the after-school club today? Noah asked, his voice steady and serious. He stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture that made Amara's breath hitch. It was an exact replica of the way Junhyuk had stood by the fireplace in his fortress. Because Mommy has a long shift at the hospital, Amara said, kneeling to zip up his jacket. She brushed a stray curl from his forehead, her fingers lingering for a second. And remember the rule, Noah. What's the most important rule? Stay with the group. Don't talk to strangers, Nia chirped, swinging her lunchbox. And don't tell anyone our middle names, Noah added, his eyes locking onto Amara's. Amara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She had given them traditional Korean middle names, names she had chosen in secret, crying in a cold apartment in London. But she lived in terror that those names, combined with their faces, would act as a beacon. She had told herself that returning to Seoul was the best move for their future. The pay was triple what she could earn elsewhere, and the medical benefits were unparalleled. She told herself that, in a city of 10 million people, she could be a needle in a haystack. But as she dropped them off and headed toward the hospital, the familiar weight of anxiety settled in her chest. Seoul had changed, but it still felt like his city. His face was no longer on the news every day, but his name, Kong *, was whispered in the corridors of power and etched into the glass of skyscraper headquarters. He was no longer just an heir. He was a titan, a man who had consolidated the disparate factions of the underworld into a legitimate, terrifying empire. Amara's shift began like any other. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, and the soft scuff of sneakers on linoleum provided a comforting rhythm. She was prepping a tray for a minor procedure in the VIP wing, a place she usually avoided, but they were short-staffed when the energy of the floor shifted. It was a subtle change at first, a sudden quiet that swept through the hallway, followed by the heavy, rhythmic tread of multiple sets of boots. Amara froze, a pair of surgical scissors trembling in her hand. She had felt this before. It was the atmospheric pressure of power. She stepped out into the hallway just as the elevator doors at the end of the corridor hissed open. A phalanx of men in dark suits stepped out, their faces stone-cold and their eyes scanning the area with lethal efficiency. They moved with a military precision that sent a jolt of recognition through Amara's spine. These weren't hospital security. These were soldiers. "Clear the hall," one of the men barked, his voice echoing off the white walls. Amara retreated into the shadows of a doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She told herself to keep her head down. She told herself she was just a nurse in a mask. She told herself he wouldn't be here. Why would the king of the Kong Syndicate be in a public hospital? But then, the center of the phalanx opened up. A man stepped forward, walking with a slow, predatory grace that made the very air in the hallway feel thin. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps his presence had simply grown to fill the space around him. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, his hands tucked into his pockets. His face, once striking in its mystery, was now devastating in its clarity. The jawline was sharper, the eyes more sunken and shadowed, as if he hadn't slept in a decade. It was him, Kang Junhyuk. He looked colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous than the man who had sheltered her from the storm. There was a scar, faint and jagged, running along the side of his neck, a souvenir of the wars he had won to keep his throne. He didn't look like a man who was capable of tenderness. He looked like a man who had burned his heart to ash to keep his empire alive. He was walking toward her. Amara pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She lowered her head, the surgical mask covering the bottom half of her face, hoping the fluorescent lights would wash out the features he might remember. She focused on her shoes, on the pattern of the floor tiles, on anything but the man who was now only 20 feet away. As he passed her, the air grew cold. She could smell it, the same scent of wood smoke and expensive, bitter cologne. It was a sensory trigger that threatened to bring her to her knees. For a second, a terrifying, crystalline second, he slowed down. Amara held her breath, her eyes squeezed shut. Keep walking. Please keep walking. The footsteps paused. She could feel his gaze, a physical weight pressing against the side of her head. It was the same scrutiny he had used in the rain, the same way he had looked at her ID badge 7 years ago. Her skin prickled with the sudden, violent urge to run, to grab her children and fly to the other side of the moon. "Nurse," he said. The voice was deeper now, roughened by time and command. It sent a shiver of pure, unadulterated terror through her. "Yes, sir," she managed to whisper, her voice muffled by the mask. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on his polished black shoes. He didn't speak for a long moment. The silence in the hallway was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system. Amara could feel the eyes of his bodyguards on her, suspicious and cold. She felt like a rabbit in the sights of a wolf. "Where is the chief of surgery?" he asked. In the briefing room, sir. Third door on the left," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger down the hall. He didn't move immediately. He stayed there for a heartbeat longer, his presence looming over her like a dark cloud. Then, without a word, he resumed his pace. The boots clicked away, the heavy doors of the briefing room swinging shut behind him. Amara collapsed into the nearest chair, her lungs burning as she finally exhaled. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to tuck them under her arms. He hadn't recognized her. How could he? She was older, she was masked, and to him she had been a one-night distraction 7 years ago. He had empires to run and enemies to kill. Why would he remember a girl from a storm? But the relief was short-lived. He was here. He was in this hospital. And her children, the children who carried his face and his blood, were only a few miles away. The invisible life she had built, the carefully constructed wall of anonymity, had just developed its first terrifying crack. She worked the rest of her shift in a state of hypervigilance, her eyes constantly darting to the security cameras and the VIP wing. Every time a door opened, she flinched. She felt like a prey animal that had just realized the predator had moved into the neighboring forest. When the clock finally struck the end of her shift, she didn't just walk out. She practically ran. She ignored the calls of her coworkers, her mind focused entirely on getting to the after-school club, on grabbing Noah and Nia and locking them inside their apartment until she could figure out how to leave the country again. She arrived at the club breathless, her hair disheveled and her eyes wide. The teacher looked at her with concern, but Amara brushed it off, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the twins. They were sitting at a small table, Nia coloring a bright purple sun, and Noah was sitting perfectly still, staring at the door. When he saw her, his expression didn't change, but he stood up immediately. He grabbed Nia's hand and led her over, his small face set in that unnerving, serious mask. "Mom, you're late," Noah said, his dark eyes searching hers. "I know, baby. I'm sorry. We have to go. Now," Amara said, her voice tight. She hurried them into the car, her hands fumbling with the keys. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a line of black sedans following her. She drove a circuitous route home, turning down side streets and doubling back, her heart only slowing when she finally pulled into their underground garage. Inside the apartment, she locked all 3 deadbolts and leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door. "Mom, why are we being fast?" Nia asked, tilting her head. "Are we playing a game?" "Just a little bit, sweetie. Go wash your hands for dinner," Amara said, trying to force a smile. Noah didn't move. He stood in the hallway, his backpack still on, watching her. He knew. He didn't know what, but he knew the world had changed. He walked up to her and placed a small, steady hand on her arm. "Is the bad man here, Mom?" he asked. Amara froze. She hadn't told him about a bad man. But Noah had an intuition that was terrifying. He could read her better than anyone on earth. She knelt down, pulling him into a tight embrace, burying her face in his neck. He smelled of crayons and laundry detergent, the smells of a normal, safe childhood. "No, Noah," she lied, her voice cracking. "No one is here. We're just being careful." She held him until he pulled away, his expression still unconvinced. That night, as she tucked them into bed, she stayed in their room long after they had fallen asleep. She watched the way Nia's chest rose and fell in a peaceful rhythm, and then she looked at Noah. Even in sleep, his jaw was set. She walked into the living room and pulled a small, locked box from the back of her closet. She opened it and pulled out the gold dragon cufflink. It caught the light of the street lamps, the dragon's eyes seeming to mock her. She had thought she was invisible. She had thought she could come back to the city and steal a life for her children. But seeing him today had reminded her of a truth she had tried to forget. You cannot steal from a man like Kang Junhyuk and expect him not to eventually notice. She looked at her phone, her thumb hovering over the delete account button for her nursing agency. She needed to leave. She needed to take the twins and disappear into the mountains or across the sea. But as she looked at her bank balance and the cost of international flights for 3 people on short notice, she realized she was trapped. The high-paying contract had been a gilded cage. She sat on the floor in the dark, the gold dragon clutched in her hand, realizing that the invisible life was over. The storm wasn't just coming. It had already arrived. And this time, there would be no mysterious stranger to save her. The following morning, the atmosphere at Seoul International Medical Center was not merely tense. It was electrified with the kind of static that precedes a massive lightning strike. Amara felt it the moment she stepped through the employee entrance. The usual security guards had been supplemented by men whose presence felt like iron. They stood in pairs at every entrance, their suits sharp, their earpieces glowing with a steady, watchful blue. The air in the lobby was thick with the scent of high-stakes urgency. A business dispute, the whispers said in the break room. A polite euphemism for the brutal, shadow war violence that defined the Kong Syndicate's world. Amara kept her head down, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She tried to lose herself in the mundane tasks of her morning rounds, but the universe seemed determined to pull her back toward the center of the storm. "Vance! My office now!" the head nurse barked, her face pale and drawn. Inside the cramped office, the news was worse than Amara had feared. A high-ranking member of the Kong family, Junhyuk's own uncle, though his name was whispered with fear, had been brought in with multiple gunshot wounds. The VIP wing was being turned into a fortress, and because of Amara's specialized surgical background and her reputation for absolute discretion, she was being reassigned. "I can't," Amara said, her voice thin. "I have patients in the general ward who—" "This isn't a request, Amara," the head nurse interrupted, her eyes darting to the door where a man in a black suit stood watching them. "The donors, the family, they requested the best. You're the best. Go to the VIP elevators. Your security clearance has already been updated." Amara walked toward the elevators like a woman heading toward a gallows. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn around, to grab the twins from their school and drive until the city of Seoul was nothing but a memory in her rearview mirror. But she was trapped. To refuse now would draw the very attention she was trying to avoid. She stood before the sleek, brushed steel doors of the VIP elevator bank. 2 guards stood on either side, their gazes as cold as the metal. One of them checked her badge, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment too long before he tapped a specialized keycard against the reader. The chime of the elevator felt like a death knell. The doors slid open, revealing a mirrored interior that reflected Amara's own terrified expression. She stepped inside, the silence of the car pressing in on her. The elevator began its ascent, the numbers on the display climbing with agonizing slowness. She adjusted her mask, ensuring it was pulled tight over the bridge of her nose, and smoothed her scrubs. "You are just a nurse," she told herself. Asterisk, "you are a ghost. You are invisible." Asterisk. The elevator slowed, a soft chime announcing the arrival at the 12th floor, the most exclusive medical wing in Asia. The doors hissed open. Amara's breath caught in her throat. Standing directly in front of the elevator, waiting to descend, was the very man she had seen in her nightmares for 7 years. Kang Junhyuk was not alone. He was flanked by 4 massive bodyguards, but they seemed to fade into the background in the presence of his overwhelming gravity. He was dressed in a black suit that looked like it had been molded to his frame, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar as if he had been too busy dealing with blood and betrayal to care for formalities. In the 7 years since the storm, the world had aged him, but it had done so by refining his lethality. His features were sharper, his jawline a jagged edge of tension. The weary weight she had seen in his eyes that rainy night had hardened into something far more terrifying. A cold, calculating intelligence that saw everything as a threat or a tool. He didn't just look like a man who ran an empire. He looked like a man who had survived hell and decided to rule it. As the doors fully retracted, Amara found herself paralyzed, caught in the gravitational pull of his gaze. Junhyuk was mid-sentence, barking an order to one of his lieutenants, when his eyes landed on her. He froze. The command died in his throat. The silence that followed was absolute. The bodyguards sensed the shift instantly, their hands moving reflexively toward their jackets, their eyes scanning Amara for a weapon. But Junhyuk didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his dark, fathomless eyes locked onto hers with a piercing intensity that felt like it was stripping away her mask, her name, and her 7 years of secrets. The air in the narrow space between the elevator and the hallway became impossibly heavy. Amara's lungs burned. She had forgotten how to breathe. The scent of him, that same haunting mix of wood smoke and bitter, expensive cologne, hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back to the firelight and the silk blankets and the kiss that had ruined her for any other man. Out, Junhyuk said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in Amara's chest. The bodyguards hesitated. Sir, the meeting. I said get out, he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. The men scrambled, retreating down the hallway with practiced speed, leaving the two of them alone in the sterile, brightly lit corridor. Junhyuk took a step forward, his movements feline and predatory. Amara instinctively backed into the elevator, her hands searching for the closed door button, but he was too fast. He reached out, his hands slamming against the steel door to keep it open, the force of the movement making the entire car tremble. He stepped into the confined space of the elevator, forcing Amara back until her shoulder blades hit the mirrored wall. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a searing contrast to the air-conditioned chill of the hospital. Who are you? He whispered. Amara kept her head down, her heart hammering so hard she feared it would bruise her ribs. I am the surgical nurse assigned to your uncle, sir. I was told to report to. Look at me. It wasn't a request. It was a command that carried the weight of his entire empire. Amara slowly raised her head. She knew the moment her eyes met his, the game was over. He had a memory like a steel trap. He wouldn't have survived this long otherwise. Junhyuk's gaze traveled over her face, lingering on the curve of her eyes and the slope of her forehead. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her mask. For a second, Amara thought he might rip it off, but he stopped, his hand trembling with a repressed emotion she couldn't identify. 7 years, he murmured, more to himself than to her. 7 years I looked for a ghost. I searched every corner of this city, every flight manifest, every hospital record. Amara's blood turned to ice. He had searched for her? You vanished, he continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. Like you were never there. Like the storm had simply made you out of thin air and taken you back when the sun rose. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. But here you are, wearing a different name, hiding behind a mask, working in my hospital. I don't know what you're talking about, sir, Amara lied, her voice cracking. You must have me confused with someone else. I've only been in Seoul for a few months. Junhyuk let out a dry, mirthless laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Do you think I could ever forget the woman who stole a night of my life and then left me with nothing but a gold cufflink and a hollow chest? Do you think I don't know the sound of your heart racing, Amara? He called her by her name, the name she hadn't used in 7 years, the name that linked her to the girl in the rain. I am a mother now, she blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was a desperate attempt to create distance, to show him she was no longer the girl he remembered. I have a life, family. Please, just let me do my job. At the mention of family, Junhyuk's expression shifted. The cold curiosity vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp suspicion that made Amara's skin crawl. He didn't know about the twins, he couldn't know. But the mere mention of her having a life without him seemed to strike a nerve. A family, he repeated, the words sounding like a curse in his mouth. And where is this family, Amara? Does the father of your children know you're hiding in the shadows of the Kong Syndicate? That is none of your business, she snapped, a flicker of her old defiance returning. Junhyuk's eyes darkened. He moved even closer, his arm pinning her against the wall. Everything in this city is my business. And you are the only piece of my past I haven't been able to control. That ends today. Before she could respond, the elevator's emergency alarm began to chime. The doors, which he had been holding open with his hand, were struggling to close. Sir, we have a breach on the floor. A voice crackled over his bodyguard's radio out in the hall. Junhyuk didn't blink. He kept his eyes fixed on Amara, his jaw set in a hard line. We aren't finished, he whispered. Do not think you can run again. I have guards at every exit. I have eyes on every street. You are staying exactly where I can see you. He stepped back, allowing the elevator doors to his shut. Amara watched his cold, regal silhouette disappear as the mirrors took over the space. She collapsed to the floor of the elevator the moment the car began to move, her breath coming in jagged, sobbing gulps. He knew. He had found her. But the most terrifying part wasn't that he recognized her. It was the realization that he was still looking for her. As the elevator reached the ground floor, Amara scrambled to her feet. She had to get to the school. She had to get the twins. But as she stepped out into the lobby, she saw them. The men in black suits, standing by the exits, their eyes scanning the crowd. She was in the heart of his fortress, and for the first time in 7 years, she realized that the storm she had been running from wasn't a weather event. It was a man, and he was never going to let her go. The following hours were a blur of adrenaline and clinical detachment, a survival mechanism Amara had perfected over years of living on the edge of a secret. She threw herself into her work in the VIP wing, her hands moving with a robotic precision that belied the screaming panic in her mind. She monitored the monitors, adjusted the 4 drips for Junhyuk's uncle, and kept her eyes fixed on the floor whenever the heavy footsteps of the Kong Syndicate guards echoed through the suite. She told herself that if she played the part of the dedicated professional long enough, she could slip away. But destiny had other plans, and they were far more cruel than the storm that had started it all. A frantic call from the twins' school shattered her fragile composure. Nia had tripped on the playground, suffering a deep gash on her forehead that required immediate stitches. With the hospital under a virtual lockdown and her own car blocked by the syndicate's motorcade, Amara had no choice. She had to have them brought to her. She used her staff credentials to bypass the primary chaos, arranging for a trusted hospital courier to pick them up and bring them to the secure staff lounge adjacent to the VIP wing. She thought they would be safe there. She thought she could stitch Nia's wound, tuck them into a corner, and finish her shift before disappearing into the night. She was wrong. Amara was finishing her rounds when the heavy double doors of the VIP corridor swung open. She expected a nurse or a doctor. Instead, she saw her children. A flustered young intern was leading them in, holding Nia by the hand, who had a large white bandage taped clumsily over her brow. Noah followed behind, his small backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression as unreadable and serious as ever. "Mom!" Nia cried out, her voice echoing too loudly in the sterile silence. She broke free and ran toward Amara, her small sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Amara's heart stopped. She knelt, catching Nia in her arms, but her eyes were already darting frantically down the hallway. The VIP suite doors were cracked open. The guards were standing at attention. "Shh, Nia. Baby, you have to be quiet," Amara whispered, her hands trembling as she checked the bandage. "Mommy is working. We have to be very, very still." Noah walked up beside them, his eyes scanning the hallway with a strange, analytical depth. He didn't look scared, he looked suspicious. He sensed the predatory energy in the air long before he saw the predator. "Nurse Vance." The voice was like a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Amara froze, her breath catching in her lungs. She slowly stood up, keeping Nia tucked behind her leg and her hand resting protectively on Noah's shoulder. Kang Junhyuk stood at the entrance of the VIP suite. He had discarded his jacket, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour making decisions about life and death, and he was clearly not finished. He didn't move toward them immediately. He stayed in the doorway, his dark eyes narrowing as they landed on the 2 small figures standing beside Amara. The air in the hallway seemed to thicken, the oxygen replaced by a suffocating, heavy static. Junhyuk's gaze shifted from Amara to the children, and for a moment, the mask of the Mafia king slipped. A look of profound, soul-shattering confusion crossed his face. He looked at Nia, her bright eyes and soft features, and then his gaze moved to Noah. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the silence of a man watching a ghost take flesh. Junhyuk took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a beautiful, dangerous animal. He ignored the guards, ignored the doctors, ignored the entire world. His focus was a laser beam directed at the boy standing by Amara's side. Amara felt the walls closing in. She could smell him now, that wood smoke and bitter cologne, and she knew he recognized her. Not just as the girl from the storm, but as the woman who had robbed him of 7 years. He recognized her eyes in the girl, and his own soul in the boy. He stopped 3 feet away. His shadow fell over them, long and dark. He didn't look at Amara. He stared down at Noah, his jaw working as he tried to process the impossible reality standing before him. The resemblance was not just a coincidence. It was a biological certainty. Noah had the same tilt of the head, the same stubborn set of the jaw, and the same dark, piercing eyes that seemed to hold a world of secrets. Amara was paralyzed, her hand gripping Noah's shoulder so hard her knuckles were white. She wanted to scream, to run, to shield them with her own body, but she was rooted to the spot by the sheer force of Junhyuk's presence. Noah, however, did not share his mother's fear. He felt the weight of the man's stare, and he didn't like it. He didn't know who this man was, only that he was making his mother tremble. With a slow, defiant movement, Noah stepped forward, breaking away from Amara's grip. He planted his feet firmly on the hospital floor and crossed his small arms over his chest, a gesture so identical to Junhyuk's own habitual posture that one of the guards in the background let out an audible, muffled gasp. Noah looked the most dangerous man in South Korea dead in the eye. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. "Why are you staring at my mom?" Noah demanded. His voice was small, but it carried a sharp, authoritative edge that cut through the tension like a blade. "It's rude." The hallway went tomb quiet. The guards reached instinctively for their holsters, their eyes wide with shock at the audacity of the child. No one spoke to Kang Junhyuk that way. No one challenged his gaze. Junhyuk didn't react with anger. He froze, his breath hitching in a way that signaled a total internal collapse. He looked down at the boy who was a miniature version of himself. A boy who possessed his fire, his pride, and his face. "Noah, come back here," Amara whispered, her voice a ragged plea. But Junhyuk finally looked up. He didn't look at the nurse. He looked at Amara Cole, the girl he had held in the storm. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The timeline, the night in the penthouse, the way she had vanished, the way he had felt a piece of his soul leave with her. He looked back down at Noah, his voice a gravelly, broken whisper when he finally spoke. "What is your name?" he asked. Noah didn't answer immediately. He maintained his cross-armed stance, his eyes searching the man's face with a level of scrutiny that was unnerving. "My mom says I shouldn't tell strangers my name." A ghost of a smile, a painful, tragic thing, touched Junhyuk's lips. It was a reflex, a recognition of his own blood. "I am not a stranger," he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. I am someone who knew your mother a long time ago." He looked at Amara then, and the cold, lethal king was gone. In his place was a man who had just realized he had been living a half-life. His eyes were bright with a mixture of fury, longing, and a desperation so raw it made Amara want to weep. "Amara," he said, her name sounding like a prayer and a threat all at once. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me this is a dream." Amara couldn't speak. She could only pull Nia closer, her eyes welling with tears she had held back for 7 years. The secret was out. The invisible life was over. The dragon had found its hoard, and he was never going to let them go again. Junhyuk took another step, his hand reaching out instinctively toward Noah, his fingers trembling as they hovered near the boy's shoulder. "Why are you staring?" Noah asked again, his voice softening slightly as he sensed the man's strange, vibrating energy. "Because," Junhyuk whispered, his gaze locked onto the son he never knew he had. "I think I've been looking for you my entire life." Amara closed her eyes as the first tear fell. The collision she had feared for 7 years had finally happened, and as the hospital lights hummed overhead, she realized that while she had hidden the twins to save them from the Mafia, she had just delivered them directly into the heart of the Empire. The air in the VIP corridor didn't just feel cold. It felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out, replaced by a suffocating, pressurized silence. Every person in that hallway, the elite nursing staff, the interns, the seasoned surgeons, seemed to stop mid-breath, their gazes darting between the towering, lethal figure of Kang Junhyuk and the small, defiant boy who shared his soul. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to die away, leaving only the frantic, uneven rhythm of Amara's heart as it pounded against her ribs. Behind Junhyuk, his personal security detail reacted with the mechanical, violent instinct of trained wolves. At Noah's sharp challenge, two of the guards reflexively reached for the holsters concealed beneath their charcoal-gray jackets, their eyes narrowing as they assessed the tiny threat that had dared to disrespect the king of the Kong Syndicate. The movement was subtle, a mere shifting of fabric and leather, but to Amara, who had lived for 7 years in the shadow of this fear, it was like watching a firing squad take aim. Wait! Junhyuk's voice wasn't a shout, but it carried the weight of a thunderclap. He didn't turn his head. He didn't even look at his men. He simply raised a single hand, palm flat, a silent and absolute command to stand down. The guards froze, their fingers lingering on the grips of their weapons, their confusion evident even through their stoic masks. They were used to Junhyuk reacting to insolence with a cold, swift ruthlessness. They were not prepared for the sight of their boss being rendered utterly motionless by a child. Junhyuk's eyes were no longer those of the cold-blooded businessman who had arrived to oversee a family tragedy. They were the eyes of a man undergoing a violent internal tectonic shift. He remained half-knelt, his focus anchored on Noah's face with a devastating intensity. He traced the sharp, proud line of the boy's jaw, the exact curve of his ears, and those eyes dark, ancient, and filled with a stubbornness that Junhyuk recognized as his own primary survival trait. It was an impossible resemblance. It wasn't just a matter of features. It was the way the boy held himself, the way he occupied space with a natural, unearned authority. The mini-clone, standing before him, was a living receipt of a debt Junhyuk hadn't known he owed. As he stared at Noah, the timeline began to click into place with the cold, mechanical precision of a safe being cracked. 7 years. He remembered the date of the storm with agonizing clarity. He remembered the day he had buried his father, the day he had stood on that balcony and realized the woman who had tasted of brandy and hope was gone. 2 weeks later, she had vanished from the university records. 9 months after that, Junhyuk felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since the night his father died. It was the feeling of a vacuum being filled with a sudden, overwhelming truth. He looked at Nia, huddled behind Amara's leg, her soft, inquisitive eyes mirroring Amara's own, and then back to Noah. Twins. He hadn't just lost a woman. He had been robbed of a legacy. The accident that had brought him to the hospital, the shooting of his uncle, the internal power struggles of the syndicate, the threats from rival gangs, suddenly felt like insignificant noise. The business of blood and empires, which had been his only reason for breathing for a decade, seemed to shrink and fade until only these 3 people remained in his field of vision. His mission had changed. He wasn't here to protect an uncle. He was here to claim a kingdom he hadn't known existed. Noah, please, Amara whispered, her voice a ragged, desperate thread. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she caught the back of the boy's shirt, trying to pull him back into her orbit of safety. I'm so sorry, sir. He doesn't know. He's just a child. We were just leaving. Junhyuk finally moved. He stood up slowly, his joints seemingly stiff, as if he had aged 40 years in the span of 40 seconds. He didn't look like he was going to let them leave. He looked like a man who had finally found the one thing in the world worth holding on to. Leave, Junhyuk repeated. The word sounded foreign to him, a concept that no longer applied to her. He looked at Amara then, and the raw, exposed emotion in his gaze made her want to flinch. There was no more mask. There was only a devastating, hungry longing. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way she shielded the children with her own body, and a flicker of deep, agonizing regret crossed his face. He realized then that for 7 years, she had viewed him as the monster he had become, while he had viewed her as the angel he had lost. You weren't just a nurse, he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that only she could hear. You weren't just a student in a storm. You were the mother of my children, and you were hiding in my own city. I was protecting them, Amara snapped, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, maternal rage. I saw what your world does to people, Junhyuk. I saw the news. I saw the blood. I didn't want this for them. Junhyuk flinched as if she had struck him. He looked down at Noah, who was still watching him with those unblinking, judgmental eyes. The boy hadn't moved an inch. He was still the barrier between the Mafia king and his mother. It doesn't matter what you wanted, Junhyuk said, and the cold, authoritative edge returned to his voice, though it was now tempered by a possessive desperation. They carry my blood. They have the Kong name written in their very DNA. Do you think I will let my heirs live in a cramped apartment and hide in the shadows of a hospital ward? They aren't heirs, Amara cried, her voice rising in a way that drew the attention of the entire hallway. They are my children. They are Noah and Nia. They are people, not pieces on your chessboard. Junhyuk stepped forward, closing the distance until he was towering over her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, a cage of charcoal soot and wood smoke scent. They are both, Amara, and because they are mine, they are in more danger than you can possibly imagine. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging his head of security. Cancel the board meeting. Tell the surgeons that my uncle's recovery is now the secondary priority. I want a secure motorcade at the private entrance in 5 minutes. Sir? The guard asked, his eyes darting to Amara. I am taking my family home, Junhyuk commanded. Amara felt the world tilt.
No.
No, you can't do this. I have a job, I have. Junhyuk leaned down, his face inches from hers. You have nothing but me now, Amara. You stayed away for 7 years. You had your turn. Now it is mine. He looked down at Noah, who had finally dropped his arms, his expression shifting from defiance to a quiet, intense curiosity. The boy saw the way the big, scary man looked at him. Not with anger, but with a strange, vibrating awe. Is he the boss? Noah asked, looking up at Amara. Junhyuk didn't wait for her to answer. He reached down and for the first time he touched his son. He placed a large, calloused hand on Noah's head, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the soft curls. I am the man who is going to make sure no one ever stares at your mother again, Junhyuk said, his voice a promise and a threat. He stood up and looked at his men. Escort them. If so much as a hair on their heads is touched, I will burn the city to the ground. As the guards moved in to surround them, forming a human shield of black suits and lethal intent, Amara realized that the invisible life was truly dead. She looked at Junhyuk, who was watching her with a dark, terrifying possessiveness, and she knew that while she had run from the storm 7 years ago, the storm had finally caught up. She took Nia's hand and Noah's hand, pulling them close as they were ushered toward the private elevator. Behind them, Junhyuk followed, his gaze never leaving the back of Noah's head. He had forgotten the uncle, the business, and the wars. He had a new mission now. He was a father, and he was going to claim every single second he had missed, no matter who he had to break to do it. The transition from the sterile, fluorescent reality of the hospital to the oppressive opulence of the Kong estate happened in a blur of tinted glass and high-speed motorcades. Amara sat in the back of a custom-armored SUV, her arms wrapped tightly around Noah and Nia, as if she could physically shield them from the world they were being pulled into. Outside the windows, Seoul zipped by, a city she had once walked through as a free woman, now reduced to a series of fleeting images viewed from inside a cage. Junhyuk sat in the vehicle directly ahead, a silent shadow leading them into the heart of his empire. When the heavy iron gates of the estate finally hissed shut behind them, the sound was final, like a tomb closing. The property was even more imposing than Amara remembered. It sat atop the hill, a sprawling fortress of dark stone and reinforced glass, surrounded by manicured gardens that felt too perfect, too silent. Everywhere she looked, men in black suits stood at attention, their eyes scanning the perimeter with a focus that made the hair on her arms stand up. Is this a castle, Mom? Nia whispered, her eyes wide as she pressed her face against the window. Are we princesses now? It's a house, Nia. Just a house, Amara replied, though her voice lacked conviction. She looked at Noah, who wasn't looking at the gardens. He was looking at the guards. He was counting them. The SUV came to a halt in the sweeping circular driveway, and the door was opened by a man who bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Junhyuk was already there, waiting. He had discarded his tie, his shirt collar open, and for a fleeting second, the afternoon sun caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look less like a monster and more like the man who had found her in the rain. But the moment passed the second he spoke. "Bring their things to the east wing," he commanded, his voice echoing in the vast stone courtyard. "Ensure the children's rooms are prepared immediately." He stepped toward the car, offering a hand to Amara. She ignored it, climbing out on her own and pulling the twins close to her side. The tension between them was a physical presence, a vibrating wire that threatened to snap at any second. Junhyuk's eyes darkened at the rejection, but he didn't press her. Instead, his gaze dropped to Noah. "Do you like it here, Noah?" Junhyuk asked, his voice softening in a way that clearly unsettled his nearby lieutenants. Noah looked up at the towering facade of the house, then back at the line of black-suited men. "Why are there so many soldiers?" he asked, his voice steady. "Are we at war?" Junhyuk froze. He looked at Amara, a flicker of guilt crossing his features before it was replaced by that impenetrable wall of duty. "They are here to make sure you can play without worry," he said. It was a half-truth, the kind of lie men like him told to keep their consciences clean. Inside, the estate was a masterpiece of fortress chic. The ceilings were vaulted, the floors polished marble, and the walls adorned with art that probably cost more than the hospital where Amara worked. But beneath the luxury, the machinery of a criminal empire hummed. Amara saw the discreet security cameras in the corners of the ornate molding. She saw the biometric scanners on the doors. This wasn't a home, it was a command center. Junhyuk led them to the east wing, a section of the house that had been hastily renovated to accommodate a family. The rooms were filled with toys, high-end electronics, and clothes that still had the tags on them, thousands of dollars of apology, gifts from a father who didn't know how to be one. "I need to talk to you," Amara said, her voice tight as she ushered the twins toward a playroom where a nanny, vetted by the syndicate, was waiting. "Alone?" Junhyuk nodded and led her into a private study. The room smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and him. He closed the heavy oak door, and for the first time since the hospital, they were truly isolated. "You can't keep us here, Junhyuk," Amara began, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "This isn't a life. It's a kidnapping. My children deserve to go to school, to see the sun, to live without men with guns standing over their beds." Junhyuk walked over to a decanter and poured himself a glass of amber liquid, his back to her. "The world changed the moment I saw his face in that hallway. Amara, my enemies have eyes everywhere. If I let you walk out those gates, you would be dead or used as leverage within the hour. Is that the life you want for them?" He turned around, and the raw conflict in his eyes stopped her mid-sentence. He looked torn, caught between the growing, terrifyingly deep feelings he still held for the woman who had haunted his dreams and the brutal, blood-soaked reality of the crown he wore. "I missed 7 years," he whispered, stepping closer until he was within her personal space. "I missed their first steps. I missed their first words. I spent 7 years building an empire because I thought I had nothing else to live for. And now I find out that the only things that matter were hidden in a hospital ward. I hid them to save them." Amara cried, her hand instinctively going to the place where she used to wear the gold dragon cufflink. "Look at this place. It's a tomb. You call this safety, but I see a target on their backs." Junhyuk reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm. Amara flinched, but she didn't pull away. The heat of his touch was a memory she couldn't erase, a reminder of the night when he was just Junhyuk, and she was just Amara. "I am the most powerful man in this country," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. "I have built walls that no one can breach. I have soldiers who would die before they let a single shadow touch Nia or Noah." He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers. "You are safe here, Amara. I promise you, no one gets past these walls. Not the rivals, not the police, and certainly not the ghosts of my father's past." "And who protects them from you?" she whispered. "Who protects them from the man who sees people as assets?" Junhyuk didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he leaned down, his lips ghosting over her temple. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it broke her heart all over again. He was the monster who had stolen her freedom, but he was also the only man she had ever loved. "I will give you everything," he murmured. "The world, if you want it. Just stay. Just let me be their father." Amara closed her eyes, the scent of him overwhelming her senses. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the wind was pushing her toward the abyss. She didn't trust the guards, she didn't trust the walls, and most of all, she didn't trust the way her own heart beat faster when he was near. But as the sun began to set over the Kong estate, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floors, a chilling thought entered her mind. Junhyuk spoke of walls and soldiers, but he had forgotten one thing. The most dangerous threats usually come from the people you let inside. Across the hall, in the playroom, Noah stood by the window, watching the sun disappear. He didn't look like a child playing with toys. He looked like a prince observing his kingdom, and his eyes were full of questions that even Junhyuk wasn't ready to answer. Mom says the walls keep the bad people out, Nia said, holding up a drawing. Noah didn't turn around. He watched a guard walk past the window, the man's hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. Walls don't just keep people out, Nia, he whispered, his voice sounding far too old for a 6-year-old. They keep us in. In the study, Junhyuk held Amara, his grip desperate and tight, as if he could hold back the tide of violence that was already rising to meet them. He truly believed he could protect them. He truly believed his fortress was impenetrable. He had no idea that the silent breach had already begun. The heavy silence of the Kong estate was not the silence of peace. It was the pressurized quiet of a tomb. Amara sat on the edge of the oversized bed in the nursery wing, watching the steady rise and fall of Nia's chest as the little girl finally succumbed to the exhaustion of her strange, new life. Noah was in the bed beside her, though he wasn't asleep. He lay on his back, eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling, his small face illuminated by the soft glow of a night light. Outside the door, the muffled footsteps of guards provided a rhythmic reminder that they were the most protected people in the country. Miles away, in the heart of the city, Kong Junhyuk sat at the head of a massive obsidian table, his eyes cold as he stared down the remaining board members of the Kong Syndicate. It was a critical meeting, a restructuring of power intended to finalize the legitimization of the family business. Every time his phone buzzed with a mundane security update from the estate, a flicker of tension eased in his shoulders. He had spent millions on the biometric encryption of that house. He had handpicked the men standing at the nursery door. He believed, with the arrogance of a king, that he had built a world where his past could no longer touch his future. He was wrong. Security is only as strong as the hands that hold the keys, and at 9:42 p.m., the keys were turned by a ghost. Inside the estate's high-tech security hub, a senior technician, a man who had served the Kong family for 15 years, reached out and typed a final, devastating string of code. With a soft click of a mouse, the fortress of secrets went blind. The motion sensors in the east wing went dark. The biometric locks on the nursery doors shifted from armed to maintenance mode. The external cameras began a looped feed of a peaceful, empty garden from 10 minutes prior. Amara felt the shift before she heard it. As a nurse, she was attuned to the subtle hum of machinery, the white noise of a building's life. Suddenly, the low vibration of the central air and the electronic whine of the security panels vanished. The room felt unnaturally still. "Mom!" Noah whispered, sitting up. He had sensed it too. The hair on the back of his neck was standing up, his dark eyes searching the shadows of the room. "Stay there, Noah," Amara said, her voice a low, urgent command. She stood up, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. She walked toward the door, expecting to see the silhouettes of the guards through the frosted glass. The silhouettes were gone. Amara reached for the handle, her breath hitching in her throat. The door, which should have required a thumbprint and a code, swung open with a terrifying ease. The hallway was empty. The two men who had been stationed there were nowhere to be seen, replaced by a lingering, metallic scent that Amara recognized from her trauma rotations at the hospital. Then the shadows moved. Out of the darkness of the service corridor, 4 figures emerged. They didn't wear the suits of the Kong Syndicate. They were dressed in matte black tactical gear, their faces hidden behind ballistic masks that made them look like faceless demons. They moved with a predatory, silent efficiency, the kind of movement that only comes from years of specialized killing. These were not street thugs. This was the Black Ops team that had executed the Godfather Kang Dae-sung. "No!" Amara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as she threw herself back into the nursery. She slammed the door shut, But without the electronic bolt, it was useless. A heavy boot kicked the wood inward, the force of the blow sending Amara sprawling across the floor. She scrambled to her feet, her maternal instincts overriding the paralyzing terror. She grabbed a heavy, decorative brass lamp from the bedside table, swinging it with a desperate, wild fury. "Don't touch them!" she shrieked. The lead operative caught the lamp in midair, his movements effortlessly superior. He twisted it out of her hand and shoved her back against the wall. Amara didn't stop. She fought like a lioness, scratching, biting, and kicking at the armored men. She was a woman of healing, but in that moment, she was a creature of pure, lethal protection. She managed to sink her teeth into the arm of one operative, drawing blood through the tactical fabric, earning her a brutal backhand that sent her spinning toward the floor, her vision exploding into white stars. "Mommy!" Nia screamed, waking up to a nightmare of black-clad men looming over her bed. Noah was already out of bed, his small fists clenched, his face a mask of cold, concentrated rage that was a terrifying echo of his father. He tried to bite the hand of the man who reached for him, but he was a 6-year-old child against professional soldiers. One of the men produced a small, pressurized canister. A hiss of sedative gas filled the air. Amara tried to crawl toward them, her fingers clawing at the thick carpet, her voice failing as the chemical fog hit her lungs. "Please," she gasped, her vision fading. "Not the kids, please." The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the sight of her children being tucked into heavy tactical bags, their small forms disappearing into the shadows of the fortress that was supposed to keep them safe. Across the city, Junhyuk was mid-sentence when his phone vibrated on the obsidian table. It wasn't a standard update. It was a Red Alpha alert, a silent alarm triggered by a hardwired failsafe he had installed personally, one that even the security hub couldn't deactivate. He stared at the screen, his face draining of all color until he looked like a man made of ash. The device slipped from his hand, clattering onto the table. "Sir?" one of the board members asked, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere. Junhyuk didn't answer. He stood up, his chair flying backward and crashing against the floor. He didn't grab his jacket. He didn't say a word. He sprinted for the exit, his heart fracturing in his chest. He had spent 7 years running from the ghosts of his father's murder, believing he had outpaced them. He had believed his walls were high enough to protect the only pieces of his soul he had left. But as he tore through the streets of Seoul, his motorcade screaming through red lights and weaving through traffic, the reality settled in with the weight of a mountain. The security hadn't been breached from the outside. It had been dismantled from within. By the time he skidded into the driveway of the estate, the iron gates were wide open, swaying mockingly in the night breeze. He didn't wait for his men. He ran through the house, his boots thundering on the marble, his voice a raw, jagged roar as he called their names. "Amara, Noah, Nia." He reached the nursery wing and stopped. The door was hanging off its hinges. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the soft, mechanical tick of a toy clock on the wall. Amara lay crumpled on the floor, her face bruised, her breathing shallow and labored. The beds were empty, the silk blankets were tossed aside, and Noah's small, blue stuffed dinosaur lay abandoned in the center of the room. Junhyuk fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he picked up the toy. He let out a sound. Not a cry, but a hollow, guttural howl of a man who had just watched his entire world vanish into the night. He had the money, he had the power, he had the walls. But as he sat in the ruins of his family's safety, the king of the Kong Syndicate realized he was utterly alone. The war wasn't coming. It was already over, and he had lost the only thing that made him human. The silent breach was complete. Noah and Nia were gone, and the ghosts of the past had finally come to collect their debt. The silence following the abduction was more violent than the breach itself. Junhyuk stood in the center of the nursery, his fingers white-knuckled as they crushed Noah's stuffed dinosaur. The air was still thick with the chemical tang of sedative gas, and Amara was only just beginning to stir on the floor, her fingers twitching as she clawed back toward consciousness. When her eyes finally opened and landed on the empty beds, the scream that tore from her throat was a jagged blade that sliced through Junhyuk's remaining sanity. It was the sound of a mother's soul fracturing, and it was the last thing he needed to hear to let the monster out. He didn't comfort her. He couldn't. If he touched her now, the rage vibrating in his marrow would consume them both. He simply turned to his head of security, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that sounded like grinding stones. Find out who was on the monitors. Bring me everyone who had the codes. Now. The night of fire had begun. Junhyuk did not wait for reports. He moved through the Seoul underworld like a natural disaster, a phantom of vengeance in a charcoal suit that was soon stained with the dust and blood of his enemies. He didn't ask questions with words. He asked them with his fists and the cold barrel of a gun. He tore through illegal gambling dens in Gangnam, overturned shipping offices in Incheon, and burned down the private clubs where the city's most dangerous men thought they were safe. By midnight, the word had spread through the shadows. The king of the Kong syndicate had lost his heirs, and he was prepared to turn the city to ash to bring them back. Every lead led to a dead end until he found a low-level mercenary shivering in the back of a refrigerated truck. The man's teeth chattered, not from the cold, but from the sight of Junhyuk's eyes. He gave up a location, a derelict shipyard warehouse on the fringes of the Han River, a place where the rust and the river fog swallowed secrets whole. Junhyuk didn't call for a tactical team. He didn't wait for backup. He drove his obsidian sedan through the warehouse's corrugated metal gates, the screech of iron on iron announcing his arrival. He stepped out of the car before it had even stopped moving, his movements a blur of lethal, suppressed energy. The warehouse was a cavernous tomb of rotting wood and industrial skeletons. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and fear. As he moved through the shadows, he heard a sound that stopped his heart, Nia's soft, hiccuping sob, and Noah's voice, low and surprisingly steady, telling her it was going to be okay. Junhyuk moved with the silence of a ghost. He took down the 2 sentries guarding the interior office before they could even draw their breath. He kicked the heavy metal door off its hinges, prepared to see a rival syndicate leader or a foreign hit squad. What he found was far worse. Noah and Nia were huddled in the corner of a rusted shipping container, their faces smudged with dirt, but their eyes wide with relief as they saw him. But standing in the center of the room, flanked by the very Black Ops team that had murdered his father, was a man Junhyuk had trusted since childhood. His paternal uncle, Kang Moon-shik, stood there with a glass of whiskey in one hand and a burner phone in the other. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He looked like a man concluding a business transaction. You were always too emotional, Junhyuk, Moon-shik said, his voice smooth and devoid of remorse. Just like your father. He wanted to turn this empire into a charity project. He wanted to go legitimate. He forgot that the Kang family was built on blood, not board meetings. Junhyuk felt a coldness settle in his gut that no fire could touch. He looked at the Black Ops soldiers. The same gear, the same masks, the same cold efficiency that had haunted his nightmares since the night his father was gunned down. You, Junhyuk whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a rival gang. It wasn't the police. It was you. You killed your own brother. Moon-shik smiled, a thin, oily expression. I corrected a mistake, and now I'm correcting the next one. These children, they are a liability, a weakness. With them gone, and you broken by the grief, the family can finally return to the old ways. Under my leadership, the world tilted on its axis. Every sacrifice Junhyuk had made, every night he had spent mourning his father, every wall he had built to protect Amara and the twins, it had all been undermined by the man who shared his blood. The traitor wasn't at the gates. He had been sitting at the dinner table. He had been the one who deactivated the security. He was the one who had turned the fortress of secrets into a slaughterhouse. You will never touch them again, Junhyuk said, his voice dropping to a register that was barely human. Kill him, Moon-shik commanded, stepping back. The warehouse erupted into a chaos of muzzle flashes and shattered glass. Junhyuk moved with a desperation fueled by a father's love and a son's betrayal. He used the environment as a weapon, weaving through the shipping containers, his movements a symphony of violence. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the soul of his family. In the heat of the firefight, he reached the container. He scooped Nia and Noah into his arms, shielding them with his own body as he retreated toward the exit. He felt the sting of a bullet grazing his shoulder, the heat of an explosion behind him, but he didn't stop until he reached the safety of the rain-slicked docks. He slid them into the back of his car, locking the doors and pressing his forehead against the glass for a fleeting second. "Stay down," he commanded. "I'm coming back for you." He turned back toward the burning warehouse, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of the flames. Moonshik was gone, disappeared into the night, but the declaration of war was written in the soot and the blood. The internal war of the Kang family had begun, and the bloodline was now split in two. Junhyuk realized with a terrifying clarity that his father's murder was only the first chapter of a much larger conspiracy. His uncle hadn't just wanted the throne. He wanted to erase anything that resembled a heart from the Kang name. As the sirens began to wail in the distance and the shipyard burned, Junhyuk stood alone on the dock. He had saved his children, but he had lost his family. He had uncovered the truth, but the truth had cost him his peace. He looked at the car where Amara was now arriving with his security team, her face a mask of relief and terror. He knew that the walls of the estate were no longer enough. The enemy was inside the bloodline. The war for the soul of Seoul had just entered its deadliest phase. Watch out for part 2, because the real battle is only just beginning. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment Junhyuk burns the rest of the world down to protect what's left of his own. I am honestly speechless at how much love you've shown this story. Before we wrap up, I want to say a huge thank you to every single one of you. If you haven't told me yet, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city and country below. I read every single comment because to me, we aren't just viewers and a creator, we are a family. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the chaos of part 2 and the other amazing stories I have coming. I'll see you in the comments.